Okay, on to our second speaker, Susan Hawthorne. Susan had joined the Women Liberation Movement in 1973 and volunteered at Melbourne's Rape Crisis Centre. She has organised writers' festivals, been an aerialist in 2 women's circuses, taught English to Arabic-speaking women, worked in Aboriginal education. She is the author of 29 books of fiction, poetry and non-fiction. With Renee Klein, she founded Spinifex Press in 1991. She is a professor in the School of Humanities at James Cook University, Townsville. Susan has won awards in writing, publishing, the gay and lesbian community, and in 2007 was the winner of the Penguin Random House Best Achievement in Writing in the Inspired Awards for her work increasing people's awareness of disability. Her recent books include The Defense of Separatism, The Crisis of Patriarchy, 2020, new edition of Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization and Biodiversity, will be released in May 2022. Please welcome Susan Silva.
In my talk today, I want to walk you through the charts that I produced in Vortex, because they operate as a guide to my thinking through how the patriarchal crisis works in the different areas of political and social oppression. Nearly 2 years after completing the chapter Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology, many things have happened, including an even greater understanding of transgenderism. And I want to talk about how the charts connect to radical feminist activism against the trans ideology. I do this because the chapter on transgenderism doesn't have a chart. I was still, at the time when I was writing it, I was still digesting the complexities of what I'd been reading and experiencing. Activism depends on an analysis of the political situation, but to really get it, it helps, as Holly has just done, to make a synthesis and analogies and the like. The connections between different aspects of the analysis, and these charts make it possible to see those links. For example, a person might be interested in the politics of disability but be pro-trans. If you can show how oppressive systems work in both cases, maybe they can listen a little more carefully to what you have to say about the critique of transgenderism. Okay. The first chart is in the first chapter of Vortex. I actually developed for my book Wild Politics in 2002. I'm going to have a new version later in May this year of Wild Politics, a new edition. Can you believe that at that time I was worried about binaries? And you can see that this is a binary chart. I'm writing, drawing together the key differences between isolated systems and integrated systems. And when I look at it now, what interests me is how the isolated system applies to the ideology of transgenderism. If you look at the red highlighted bits, that it's managed from the outside. They're the billionaires who are managing transgenderism. It is really big on products, and it's into compartmentalisation. It's very monocultural. All of these apply, actually. I'm just highlighting some of them. There are external interventions. It's also really tied into a belief in immortality. And I'll highlight that one because that connects to what Jennifer Bilek is writing about in terms of transhumanism. I don't know whether I think they're going to live forever. I mean, Jesus, where's the world going to go there? So isolated systems are the ones that neoliberal patriarchal capitalists assent to. In chapter 2, Less Than Perfect, Medical Wars Against People with Disabilities, there are some areas that really leap out for me. The first row under people with disabilities, for those in the disability sector, there is a multiple labelling that goes on by the powerful. And it's not something that individual people with disabilities necessarily apply to themselves, but it is chopped up. And when you look at similar things that are done with African Americans under slavery, they were also turned into half-caste quadroons, etc., etc., etc. And it's very similar to the Indian caste system. What I find really puzzling is that under the gender classificatory system, where there are now at least 56 categories, although somebody about a week ago told me there were now 78. I have no idea what they are. But the trans community is applying this to themselves. Why? They're dividing themselves. It's really total madness. It seems really clear to me that they do not understand how they're being managed by an exterior force, the billionaires, the NGOs, the law firms, governments, the medical industrial system. In the second row, I refer to the process of infantilisation of people with disabilities. Trans people seem to think that too, but they are so woke, they're going to be endlessly hurt by disagreement, the snowflake syndrome. They're all going to melt when we look at them. Again, this is not a purpose for a political movement. In the fifth row, down in red, the claim that prior to transitioning, unhappiness is the norm. And there I talk about how people with disabilities are assumed to be unhappy all the time. And it isn't true. But that a person who wants to transition is likely to commit suicide if he or she does not transition, with all the irreversible health and surgical consequences that entails. And if you want a counter to that, Max Robinson's book, Detransition, is really good on that. This chapter is called Feminist Cassandras, Men's Patriotic Wars Against Women's Intimate Lives. And in lots of ways, this chart is really a key to what's going on everywhere. And you can see I've got the militarism, capitalism, fundamentalism, the sex industry, and the trans industry lined up there. The red row at the end is my new bit. It's not in the book. It's actually taken me a while to figure out how to do that. And you can see that in the first part, I talk about new recruits. On the new recruits to all these different ideologies, it's very similar to how it operates in the military, under capitalism, under fundamentalism, the sex industry and the trans industry, and most of them rely on traumatised young people joining them, or are overly protected in some way. And in the trans industry, it's young lesbians who have suffered sexual abuse or harassment, or who don't want to fit in to the major ideology of patriarchy. In the next one, there are big promises that are made. You know, you're going to be a martyr. I mean, what better? What an idea in life. But for the trans, it's promises of popularity. And if you're a young lesbian, that's like heaven. And then there are promises of other things, you know, material reward if you're a young capitalist and you join the finance industry. For trans men, there's the promise of increased wages. But if you're going to be a trans woman, actually your salary rate goes down, because that would be discrimination. And, you know, the men like Bob Connell, who became Raywin Connell, got his promotion after he got his promotion as a man to professor, then he transitioned. They should have given him a lower wage, I think. Then there's the instilling very high levels of different kinds of fervour And in the trans ideology, there is a high punishment level for those who don't comply. And the same applies to beliefs and hatreds, for their instilling hatred of self and encouraging the idea that changing the body will change. Then there are examples of those who moved out of the trans industry, and they then get punished. So the detransitioners are a front line of punishment. There's also a problem of dislocation, insecurity, broken links to former lives. If you're a young trans man, how can you talk about your past? Can you talk about your childhood as a girl? It's going to sound a bit weird. Make them form strong horizontal bonds, make them fear and hate radical feminists, people like J.K. Rowling, Janice Raymond, all of us in here. Make them despise anyone who is critical as TERFs, except for those of us who are proud to be TERFs. Create an uncertain future, which might contain the fantasy future as a trans hero. So, you can be a porn star if you're in the sex industry, you can be a trans hero if you're in the trans community. And giving lots of publicity, including self-promotion. And you see that in all of the online stuff, the social media, all this stuff that just is going out there. On the next slide, biocolonialism and bioprospecting, wars against Indigenous peoples and women. In this chapter I wrote about resources. So the earth as a resource, people as a resource, women as a resource. So in this chapter I did have something about trans. In rows 5 and 6 I included the so-called fixes for gay and lesbian people, including transition. And this, entwined with a sense of shame, provides an opening for mining the bodies of gay and lesbian peoples and making out that it's a path to freedom, when in fact it's a newer, managed form of conversion therapy. And there's also the profiteering, and I do go into naming the profiteers in the trans chapter. They're comparable to those who profiteer from colonisation and different forms of prospecting, whether that's mining of the earth, of its resources, or bio-mining. The final solution is elimination of the different sites of resource mining, whether it's of land, colonised bodies, women's bodies, disabled and lesbian and gay bodies. Trans bodies will be next when transhumanism becomes the norm. We are all disposable. In chapter 5, Deterritoriality, breaking the spirit, land, refugees and trauma. The concept of deterritoriality is a very useful one, I think, and I draw parallels between the terra nullius of colonisation and the ways in which bodies are nullified. And I found very similar quotations from Rachel Moran's autobiography, Paid For, about her life in the sex industry as a prostitute, and Beres Charney's autobiography, No Friend But the Mountain, as a refugee on Manus Island. Both of them talk about being homeless, being isolated, having hostility around them all the time, and being homeless and landless and homeless in the body are all features of torture, trauma and colonisation. The transgender lobby plays on this sense of homelessness for their own profits. And I'll just mention a couple of the middle line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the result of persistent trauma coming about as a result of persistent and continuous expressions of hatred or diminishment of a person. And the last one under trauma, a sense of not belonging, alienation and isolation pervades the psyche of the traumatised person. And in colonisation, you get the same sorts of processes. This 1, 2, 3, 4 down, breaking the spirit of a people through dispossession and destruction of knowledge systems as language, destroying cultural meaning. And colonised people are worn down by repeated violations against them and minimisation of their own worth. And then the last one, the colonised person feels homeless in his or her own land. And then the next, colonisation, chapter 6, colonisation, erasure and torture of laws against lesbians. I really wanted to write this chapter because hardly anybody talks about lesbians in mainstream political writing. And the chart highlights all the ways in which lesbians are targeted for violence and for shame. And so it's not really any wonder that young lesbians who don't know anything about radical feminism want to jump ship, want to go into on the other side. So how lesbians are colonised? Well, we are violated, there's violence against us, but there's also erasure. The idea that lesbians are considered a nonsense. This denial of existence is a way of breaking the spirit even, and then lesbians are murdered. And I've rarely seen in the media when a lesbian is murdered that she's a lesbian. When gay boys are murdered, it's almost always referenced that they were murdered because they were gay. When lesbians are murdered, it's hardly ever mentioned that they were murdered because they were lesbians. Then there's the problem of the destruction of lesbian knowledge. Lesbians remain hidden in history, and the intentional exclusion of upfront lesbian-centred work or policies. There's much more, but lesbians are violated. I just want to mention corrective rape, the false belief that raping a lesbian will turn her heterosexual. This is really weird thinking. It's used against political prisoners and executed by gangs of young men. And then how lesbians are shamed. We all know there are many different ways lesbians are shamed. But the last one, should a lesbian become famous, she'll be remembered either only for her sexuality, that is, she's a lesbian, which means that everything else that she ever did, all her achievements remain hidden, or her sexuality will be hidden and her achievements remembered. So she'll be remembered for inventing something fabulous, but nobody will ever mention that she was a lesbian. These, I think, are the result of shame. I'll mention Max Robinson, who writes specifically of how learning about radical feminism, being able to read radical feminist and lesbian books, made it possible for her to understand her decisions to first transition and then detransition. Her chapter on the assimilation industries is one of the most insightful critiques I've read about the way in which transition surgery is sold to young lesbians. And so it was really only when I was preparing for this talk, and I should have noticed it earlier, that I realised I'd not included charts in the chapter 7, which is Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology, or chapter 8, Breaking the Spirit of the Climate Catastrophe. In a way, they were not necessary because the same issues kept repeating themselves. And it was quite clear that the links between denialism of biology and denialism of climate change have the same roots as all the colonisation, violence and oppression of the different targets of patriarchal capitalist neoliberalism. And then, going back to chapter 1, the mechanisms that I identified in that chart. And I will just say that I finish the last chapter of the book, which is quite a bit shorter, includes a critique of the appropriation of sovereignty. And so I think there are lots of crossovers there between what we're saying. So, thank you.